Wasn't Phil's lecture great last night? I mean, I was sitting there thinking, this is fantastic. I have to go next. And I certainly didn't want him to fall on his face or anything, but he could have scaled it back a little bit along the way. You know, you may have picked up along the way over the last several years that in the Bible department, we have a tendency every now and then to poke fun at Tommy Peeler. And I thought about saying, you know, it would have been, you know, nicer if I could have gone after him instead, but that's really, I mean, even as a joke, that's not fair to Tommy, because he is an excellent speaker. Most of you have heard him before. You know he's an excellent speaker, and just to hear him, I mean, even if you're from north of the Mason-Dixon line and you have no idea what he's saying, you still can tell he's a great speaker. But Phil did do a great job introducing the topic of miracles as signs, the big picture of everything that's really going on over the course of this week of talking about the miracles of Jesus. And during the day, as you've been finding out, and as Phil talked about last night as well, we're going through miracle by miracle and talking about how each one not merely displays the power of Jesus, but teaches us things about his character and his mission and his identity, that he is indeed Redeemer and Creator and King. And on Thursday night, we will come back and talk about the resurrection of Jesus as the quintessential miracle that does all of those things all at once. And tonight, you get me talking about apologetics. It really does feel like one of these things is not like the other moments from my childhood. You've got great speakers and you've got me. On the one hand, I mean, I'm no prophet or son of a prophet. I'm not a big name preacher. I don't have meetings lined up all summer long. I don't have meetings lined up all summer. But beyond that, I mean, apologetics doesn't really quite fit with everything else that's going on. And it does seem like a little bit of an odd duck, 1/15 of a lectureship devoted to this topic. But in reality, I think it is both an appropriate ratio and an appropriate topic. New Testament scholar of the 20th century named F.F. Bruce, most of you have probably heard his name at least once in your life, said very well that our task in miracles is not to defend them, but to understand them. And that is absolutely right. That is our task. And so 14 out of 15 seeking to do that, I think, is fantastic. But given the cultural context in which we live, we don't need to go 0 for 15 in defending them. We live in a culture where modern Western thinking has idolized naturalism, that there is no God, there is no supernatural, there is nothing beyond what you can see and feel and experience with your senses. And we need to be able to stand against that. We need to be able to say that we do believe in the miracles of Jesus. We do believe that Jesus was the Son of God. We do believe that he was God in the flesh. But we can't just say that, because the Bible never commends blind faith, not once. We need to know why we believe. And so our task tonight is to talk about miracles as history, that they did indeed happen some 2,000 years ago on a little strip of land in the Near East. It's also a huge topic. Entire books have been written about small areas of the topic of miracles from an apologetic perspective. And in my manuscript that's in the book, if you have that and you want to look at it, it's an attempt to touch on a wide variety of different issues related to that. Please don't try to follow along in the book tonight. We're not going to be doing that. I mean, if I tried tonight to cover in one night everything that is in that manuscript, I think Dr. Payne might be tempted to use the newly installed ejection platform for speakers 2 nights sooner than he thought he would have to. I'm sorry, Tommy. I'm glad you're a good sport. But it is a large topic, and we are going to narrow down and not talk about everything in it. I want to begin by saying just one thing about kind of a philosophical side of it that I do think needs to be said. But the bulk of what we're going to do this evening is talk about the historical perspective, talk about some of the objections from a historical perspective, and then work into a positive defense of miracles from that perspective as well. But the philosophical sides of things, there is a key reason in that why different people see things differently, why some people believe in miracles and some people disbelieve miracles from the outset. And that is just the issue of presuppositions. What is your worldview? Do you believe in the supernatural or don't you? Because fundamentally, if you don't believe in the supernatural, you're not going to believe in miracles regardless of the evidence. You have to change the worldview before you can change that specific belief. Same thing is true on the other side. If you do believe in the supernatural, then you will at least be inclined to believe in the miraculous. Whether you believe in every claim or not is a different issue, but you will at least be open to the idea. And we're not going to even try to solve that issue tonight. Worldviews is, again, it's an entire lectureship. Worldviews is. I just want to at least say that at the outset. What I do want to talk about from the philosophical perspective before we move into the historical issue is a common objection that you will hear. And because it's so common, I thought it would be worth mentioning it specifically. And that is that those people in the ancient world believed in all kinds of myths, and all kinds of gods, and all kinds of things like that. And we enlightened 21st century Western academicians are far beyond all of that silly superstition. You've heard something like that, I'm sure, right? It's a very common sort of thing to say. That, my friends, is what C.S. Lewis calls chronological snobbery. It is the uncritical assumption that everything we believe now is right, and everything that people used to believe in the past is stupid. That's not quite how he says it, but that's the essence of it. That's what chronological snobbery is. But not only is it chronological snobbery, it's flat wrong. People were not so stupid back then. They did not believe that dead people just came back to life. They did not believe that people who were born blind could suddenly start seeing. They did not believe that people could walk on water, that virgins gave birth, that 5 loaves could feed 5,000 people, or that fish would pay your taxes for you. And in fact, the Bible admits this. Have you ever noticed that the women who went to the tomb on the resurrection morning didn't believe in the resurrection? The tomb was empty. And they didn't say, "Praise Jesus, all of his promises have come true." They say, "Where'd you put the body?" And they go running back after they do believe, and they tell the apostles, and the apostles are like, "You people are crazy." I mean, Jesus has been telling them this exact thing for 3 years, and they don't believe. Why? Because dead people don't come back. That's why. And as to our advanced scientific knowledge, again, as C.S. Lewis points out in his book on miracles, Joseph's concern over Mary's pregnancy was not because of his ignorance about the reproductive process. There are things that they knew, things that everybody knows, and they were not so foolish back then. In reality, today is just like it was then. There are some people who uncritically disbelieve all miracles, and there are some people who gullibly accept every alleged miracle, and there are a whole lot of people in between the extremes. But for anyone to say that we live in an age where no critically thinking, educated, intelligent person believes in miracles is flatly untrue. But again, I don't want to get hung up on the philosophy tonight. The philosophy is interesting enough, but if I say philosophy one more time, you're probably all going to glaze over completely. The historical side, actually, I think is a lot more interesting, and that's the question we want to ask. As we look at the New Testament accounts of miracles, what good reasons do we have to believe that they actually happened some 2,000 years ago? Well, I want to begin with the weaknesses of some of the objections to miracles. And again, if you have the manuscript, if you want to look at that at some point, you can see some of the specific objections quoted and the sources they come from. I don't want to get into all of the specifics tonight, but these are actual objections that actual people have raised, great minds of science and philosophy. I'm not just making stuff up. Even if it sounds like a stupid objection, it's a real objection, starting with the improbability of miracles. This objection goes something like this: the probability of the regular is greater than the probability of the rare. And miracles would be very rare, therefore the probability is that they never happened. Well, wait a second, there are witnesses. Well, the probability of the witnesses being wrong is greater than the probability of a miracle happening. Basically, what this objection says is we should trust what normally happens to be what always happens. Or as it is said colloquially very often, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Well, what about this? Well, first of all, it's demonstrably false that something having low probability means it didn't happen. How many of you have ever heard of the story of a lottery being won? You know what the odds of that are? It's astronomical that it can't have happened. There's no possible way that it could have happened. People have been struck by lightning. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers have won a Super Bowl. You think about the skeptic that you're arguing with who raises this objection. What are the odds that all of the people over the course of history met in such a way to ultimately align that he was born? And yet there he is. What are the odds of his existence? It's demonstrably false that something having low probability means that it didn't happen. And why require extraordinary evidence anyway? And here's the problem with this extraordinary claims to require extraordinary evidence. It sounds so good, even believers quote it. I found this among other places. I think Carl Sagan is where it came from first. I found it in an apologetics textbook written by one of the foremost apologists of our generation. He is touting this, that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The problem, first of all, is there's never been a skeptic in the history of humankind who's ever defined extraordinary. What do you mean by that? Well, they have no meaning for that. You know why they have no meaning for that? Because it's not an actual point. It's rhetoric. You say it, it sounds good. Believers go, oh, yeah, I guess that's right. And they walk away confused and not sure what to say. And we know that it's not an actual point, it's just rhetoric, because people regularly believe extraordinary claims all the time with no special evidence. Go back to the lottery, for example. You're watching TV, and all of a sudden, on the bottom of the screen comes scrolling by the lotto numbers. And you think, I can't possibly believe that those are the numbers without some extraordinary evidence. They should have had like 17 cameras in that room where those balls were being drawn, pointed at every possible... No, you always believe. You've never doubted that those were the numbers. We regularly believe extraordinary claims, highly improbable claims with just regular evidence. And imagine the absurdity of this kind of argument if it was used in court. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I've provided you 500 witnesses who have never seen my client murder somebody, versus the two state's witnesses who said they have. And it happened on just one day of his life. He's 35 years old. He's lived 12,775 days, not counting leap year. Clearly, based on what is normal, based on what is probable, he has never murdered anybody, and it is your obligation to find him not guilty. Yeah, right. That's not how reality works. And we all understand that when we start thinking in normal terms. Suggesting that miracles didn't happen because they're improbable is just foolish. A very similar argument is the argument from analogy to the present. However, this, instead of drawing on probability, draws on uniformity. This is nature is a closed system. There is nothing outside of nature. There must be uniformity between the past and the present. Whatever happens now is all that could have ever happened. And since miracles do not happen now, therefore they could not have ever happened, is how that argument goes. We got a couple problems with this. First of all, go convince everybody in the world that miracles don't happen anymore. Regardless of what we individually may or may not believe in that, loads and loads and loads of people believe in miracles happening now. But even if we agreed completely that present miracles do not happen, I would suggest to you that biblical miracles are still analogous to the present world. What I mean when I say that is that miracles were not daily occurrences in Bible times. Miracles happened during the time of Moses, during the time of Elijah and Elisha, during the time of Jesus, and then a few other times besides that. But basically what you have in the Bible is a whole lot of silence about miracles going on. In several places where we're told there were no miracles going on. That is to say that it is possible, if not probable, that hundreds or even thousands of years go by with no miracle occurring. Now you tell me, if no miracle has happened since the time of Jesus 2,000 years ago, how is today still not analogous to that? We're in the exact same situation that they were in during the times of the kings at various points, perhaps, during the time of Abraham. Just like the probability argument, it doesn't work because singularities do happen. And so analogy to the present is silly as well. One that you'll hear very frequently, and this will be our last objection because the positive side is much more enjoyable, I believe. But this is one you'll hear a lot because we live in a time that is overrun with the postmodern philosophy. And fundamental to postmodernism is subjectivity. Everything is from your perspective. Everything is how you see it. And because of subjectivity, history can't be counted as reliable. Witnesses can't be trusted. And I think we need to be fair with this. Everything is indeed written from a certain perspective. And everything is indeed written with a certain motivation. And everything indeed does have some kind of bias. But saying subjectivity means you can't trust anything, that's just self-defeating is what that is. If nothing can be trusted due to subjectivity, then you can't trust the statement that nothing can be trusted due to subjectivity. It eviscerates itself from the inside out. If bias destroys reliability, then nothing is reliable because everything has some kind of bias. But again, we know that's not how reality works because there is such a thing as bad history. And for there to be bad history, there must be an objective standard to hold it up against. Say, for example, you're reading a book on World War II, and you come across a passage that is explaining to you the motivation of the Holocaust, and the author tells you that it is because of Hitler's deep love for the Jews and his desire to expedite their trip to heaven that he killed them all. You'd say you are out of your mind. That's wrong. And we know it's wrong because it can be tested against what Hitler himself actually said about what his motivations are. There can be bad history. And if there can be bad history, that means there is an objective history. Another way that you can see this is the fact that history is constantly being rewritten. I don't mean they're changing things. I mean they're refining it and trying to better understand what actually happened to get closer to that objective reality of what actually happened. And perfect objectivity is not likely. But that's a very long way away from total relativity. Reality is not subjectivity all the way down. You can trust history. And the existence of subjectivity doesn't change that. And there are a couple of other objections, but they're about as strong as these three are. Besides, again, debunking bad objections, while it might be fun in its own right, isn't quite the same thing as providing positive evidence. And that's what I want to spend the rest of our time doing, is thinking about why we should believe in miracles from a positive perspective. What evidence is there historically to suggest that we should believe in these accounts? Well, the first thing is one that seems perhaps pretty simple, but it's a point that we have to begin with, and that is that the authors claimed to write history. They present themselves as historical records. If they didn't do that, then I think we'd have a fair question of asking, should we read them as historical records? The fact that they say they do, while it doesn't prove they are accurate, it at least suggests you need to test them from that perspective. Luke explicitly claims to try to write an accurate account of the life of Jesus in the prologue of his gospel. Now, Matthew and Mark don't have a purpose statement, to be fair, but anyone who knows anything about genre looks at Matthew and Mark and compares them to Luke and says, that's the same thing. They're doing whatever Luke is doing, they're doing the same thing. I mean, an entire branch of New Testament studies is trying to figure out what's going on in the interrelationship of Matthew, Mark, and Luke because they're so similar. So if Luke is history, Matthew and Mark are history as well. John's purpose statement comes at the end of his gospel instead of the beginning, and he says that he is writing, as we talked about just last night, to convince his readers of Jesus' identity, that Jesus is the Son of God. And to be fair, that sounds much more theological than it does historical. But again, notice what he's saying. He's not saying, Jesus was a real nice guy, therefore you should believe in him. What he's doing is saying, here is the life of Jesus. Look at it. Examine it. Test it in whatever way you want to. And in the end, you should believe based on the life of Jesus that I have told you. The accounts that he has relayed. Yeah, it's theology, but it's historical theology is what it is. It's theology rooted in the actual life of Jesus. Now, again, it doesn't prove that they're accurate historically, but it does tell us that's what they were trying to do. Now, another thing that we should think about along these lines has to do with something else that skeptics like to do sometimes, and that is to demythologize Jesus. I don't know if you've ever heard of demythologizing Jesus or not, but demythologizing Jesus, of course, is an effort, you can figure it out even if you've never heard of it, to take the mythology out of the story of Jesus. The theory is, over a bunch of time, a lot of legends and mythology grew up around Jesus, and who he actually was historically is not the person you get in the biblical record. And so you have the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith people will talk about. Well, there's a problem with this, and that is that you can't demythologize Jesus. One of the things that always happens when people try to do this is they remove the miraculous elements from the story. But from an external perspective, there is no manuscript evidence whatsoever that there were ever miracle-free gospels. What you would need for this to work are old manuscripts where there are no miracles, and then a few generations later, some manuscripts where a couple miracles show up, and then a few hundred years later, all of the miracles are suddenly there. There are no such manuscripts that don't have miracles in them. We have complete copies of both Luke and John that go back to just over a century after the originals were written, and fragments that go back even closer than that. And not only do no manuscripts show any kind of mythological embellishment whatsoever, but they are so close to the time of the original that it is impossible for mythology to have developed anyway. It's just not how mythology works. So the external evidence says, no, this is not how it goes. Internally, though, it's just as strong. You take the miracles out of the story, and there's no story left. It's not like you can just go pull the supernatural stuff out and read what's left over. The gospel story only makes sense with the miracles in place. Jesus' healings and his exorcisms are an intrinsic part of his proclamation of the kingdom of God. He saw his miracles as fulfillment of prophecy. The gospel authors saw his miracles as revelation of his identity. To strip the miracles out of the story is not to demythologize Jesus and figure out who he really was, but it is to eviscerate the story and leaving nothing else behind at all. It's impossible to try to do this. So they say they try to write history, and you can't take it out and have anything sensible left. Third, an argument that I somehow failed to include in the manuscript, so if you're taking notes, this might be one you want to listen to, is a fascinating argument for the Gospels as historical records that was extremely popular in the 19th century. For some reason, it fell out of favor until only recently, where it's been revived again. It's the argument that's called undesigned coincidences. Undesigned coincidences, if you're not familiar with this, is the interlocking of various details in different documents in such a way that would be impossible if they were either independent fictions, planned fabrications, or merely copying each other. If it happened once, you'd shrug your shoulders and say, so what? But it happens over and over and over and over again throughout the Gospels, and that bears all the hallmarks of independent eyewitness testimony. Let me give you a few examples of this before we talk about it in the context of miracles. Just if that didn't make any sense, don't worry. Once you hear the examples, it'll start to click. So you've got one gospel that tells us that those who were striking Jesus at his trial told him to prophesy about who hit him, but doesn't tell you that Jesus was blindfolded. Another gospel tells you he was blindfolded, but doesn't say they were telling him to prophesy. That kind of interlocking. One gospel gives us direct dialogue about what was going on in Herod Antipas' palace. They knew what Herod said. Another gospel tells us that one of the women who ministered to Jesus was the wife of Herod's household manager. One gospel has Jesus, of all things, urging Peter to say that he loved Jesus more than the rest of the apostles did, right before he gets him to confirm his love for him 3 times. A different gospel has Peter saying that he does indeed love Jesus more than the rest of them do, right before Jesus tells him he's going to deny him 3 times. And we could go on and on like this all night. These interlocking details will not happen in independent fictions, planned forgeries, or merely copying. And these happen in miracle stories as well. Let me just give you one example of this. The one miracle that shows up in all 4 Gospels other than the resurrection is the feeding of the 5,000. Notice these details. John tells us that Jesus asked Philip where to buy bread and mentions that the miracle happened at Passover. Luke tells us that the miracle happened in the region of Bethsaida. Mark tells us that there were great crowds going to and fro and that there was green grass for the people to sit down on. Matthew hasn't gotten around to telling us about the miracle at this point because he's non-chronological in his writing, but he does tell us that Jesus castigates Bethsaida for not repenting of the mighty works that have been done there. And when he does get around to talking about the miracle, doesn't mention that it's in Bethsaida. Later in the Gospel of John, or earlier in the Gospel of John, in both places, but not in this story, we read that Philip was from Bethsaida. Well, what does all of that have to do with each other? Well, any one account leaves a bunch of open questions. You put them all together and it makes a whole lot of sense. They fit together like pieces of a puzzle. It was Passover, John says, and so there were great crowds, Mark says. It was Passover, John says, and so there was green grass, Mark says, because Passover is at the end of the rainy season. Jesus spoke to Philip, John says, because the miracle happened in Bethsaida, Luke says, because Philip was from Bethsaida. John tells us in an unrelated passage. Jesus rebukes the city of Bethsaida for not repenting in his miracles in Matthew, which was performed this miracle, the kind of the quintessential Bethsaida miracle in Luke. Now you tell me, when you look at all of this interlocking and interweaving back and forth, who copied from whom? What group of frauds got together and planned their story and couldn't get it right so that they didn't leave so many loose ends all over the place? What independent liars could magically write 4 stories that interweave like this? This is exactly what you find in independent eyewitness testimony. It's a remarkable piece of evidence. There's an entire book written on this. I should, in full disclosure, tell you that I'm the publisher of it. But it has been highly regarded by major New Testament scholars and apologists. If you're interested, it is called Hidden in Plain View by Lydia McGrew, and it is in the FC bookstore. The last thing I want to talk about, though, as we move beyond that, are historical criteria. And the value of historical criteria is debated, and I want to just focus on 3 of these kinds of things that seem like the most common sense and least debatable sorts of historical criteria, and again, show just how strong the Gospels are in this regard. The first one that I want to think about is multiple attestation. Multiple attestation means you've got different individual sources telling you about the same thing. Multiple independent witnesses testifying to an event, because that adds credibility. If one crazy person tells you they saw someone walking across the water, you don't believe it, right? But if several people all get together and say the same thing, then you've got to start thinking about whether it happened or not. Is there multiple independent witness to the miracles? Well, to the believer, it's a little bit tough, right? Because we'll say, well, ultimately, there's one source. God's behind the whole thing. Well, yeah, we do believe that. But of course, inspiration allows for human initiation and human writing styles and all of those kinds of things as well. But let's say, you know what? We'll let our skeptical friend have this one. Sure. We'll, for the sake of argument, discount inspiration. Now, how many sources are there? At least 4, but they all believe in Q. You know what Q is, right? Q is the hypothetical document that is a source, a list of sayings of Jesus that the gospel authors were copying off of. That's what Q is. They believe in that more than they believe in things we actually have evidence of, hard evidence of. But be that as it may, now we got 5. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Q predates the Gospels according to them, so that's even closer to the time. Well, then now all of a sudden the skeptics are going to say, wait a second, you can't count them as 4. They're all telling the same story, right? Okay, well, if I can't count them as 4, you can't tell me they're hopelessly contradictory. Either they're contradictory or they're all in cahoots with one another. They can't be both. You've got independent testimony in these 4 Gospels. On top of the Gospels, you've got Acts that talks about Jesus as a miracle worker. You've got various Pauline epistles that talk about Jesus as a miracle worker. Hebrews does, Revelation does as well. Depending on what you do with Josephus' debated quote, he might refer to Jesus' miracles. The Babylonian Talmud, the Jewish writings, certainly refer to Jesus as a sorcerer more than once. One New Testament scholar, Darrell Bock, said the only option not on the table is that nothing took place. That it was all made up in order to validate Jesus' status. You've got too many different, independent, early sources agreeing that it happened for nothing to have happened. In addition to the multiple attestation, you've got the value of the opponent's testimony. An enemy of the cause is extremely unlikely to speak in favor of the cause. And so their testimony is incredibly valuable. And again, you've got the Talmud saying that Jesus was a sorcerer. Why are they saying that Jesus is a sorcerer? Because he went around teaching and nothing but teaching? Well, that doesn't make any sense. On top of that, the Talmud says that it's better to die than to be healed in the name of Jesus. Where do they get this idea that people can be healed in the name of Jesus from? It suggests that there certainly was something to the claims that Jesus did amazing things. In the Gospels, as was mentioned last night as well, Jesus' enemies witnessed his healings. Jesus' enemies knew that Jesus had raised Lazarus from the dead. The one thing they thought they finally had an answer to was the exorcisms. You cast out demons by the power of Beelzebul. You notice what they're saying though, right? You cast out demons. So even as they try to explain it away, they're acknowledging that there is something that they have to explain away. Another document, the Greek Magical Papyrus, outside the Bible, talks about pagans invoking the name of Jesus to perform miracles. Now, where do you think they would have gotten the idea that Jesus' name was powerful for performing miracles? Whether it's Jews or pagans, inside the Bible or outside the Bible, all those who would least benefit from Jesus being a miracle worker claim that Jesus was a miracle worker. In addition to the great value of the opponent's testimony in favor of the miracles are the shocking things that his believers said. What is sometimes called the criterion of embarrassment, the presence of details in the story that would be embarrassing to the cause of the author or to the chief protagonist of the author, the things that a fraud would try to hide or would never write in the first place, or a believer would try to explain away, the things that no author would ever invent because they run counter to his purpose. If we limit this to just the miracle stories, we've got quite a list. In Mark chapter 3, Jesus' own family, who were later identified as his mother and brothers, seek to restrain him due to negative reactions to his miracles. In Mark chapter 6, we're told that Jesus was incapable. He was incapable of performing miracles in his own hometown. In Mark 7, right after Jesus rudely calls a woman a dog, she out-argues Jesus and convinces him to perform a miracle that he didn't want to do in the first place. In Mark chapter 8, it takes Jesus 2 tries to get a miracle right. I don't know if he was having an off day or something, but the first time he tried to heal that blind guy, he couldn't see right. So he had to try again. Well, I'd encourage you to hear Dr. Hamilton's lecture on that miracle specifically later on. But you think about this. Why are these miracles being told this way? I mean, you've got in Matthew chapter 11 the fact that Jesus is being called a drunkard, right? And so John, which is written later on, just makes up this story about Jesus mass-producing the best wine that anyone had ever tasted. What believer is going to make that up in that context? Now, you may chafe at the negative way that I've presented these accounts, and you might even well suggest that there's an alternate interpretation that removes the embarrassment. And I say that is precisely the point. A forger would leave no room for such embarrassment to Jesus. It would have been written in such a way to remove the chance of any such interpretation. Only an author who is deeply interested in reporting the truth of what had happened would include those kinds of details. So you have on the one hand Jesus' enemies admitting that he did miraculous things. And on the other hand, you've got his friends, including details a fraudulent historian would have omitted. You don't get better testimony than that. And that's not the entirety of the life of Jesus. That's the miracles of the life of Jesus. And they come from a half dozen or so sources, plus what is outside the Bible. You've got the undesigned coincidences fitting together like puzzle pieces in a way that no fraud could have ever done it. You've got the impossibility of them being later legendary embellishments. You have very good reason to believe in the miracles. So much more could be said, and so much more has been said. I've said more in the manuscript, and I've pointed you in directions if you're interested to find even more than that. But even with all that we've covered, and even if time were no object, all that we could cover, miracles are still not proven. They're still not beyond all doubt. Yeah, showing the folly of the objections to miracles is important. And building a historical case for the reality and reliability of the witness is vital. But ultimately, the miracles of Jesus, like so much else, remain a matter that the Christian must accept by faith. And I hope that I've shown you tonight that it is indeed a reasonable faith, because as I said at the beginning, the Bible never commends blind faith. But it is indeed up to the individual to consider the evidence, to weigh the evidence, and to decide to believe or not. And I would love to stand here and tell you unequivocally that I do believe. But the thing about real belief is that it is formative in our lives. Belief in Jesus changes who you are. And while I might say I believe, I look at my life and I know that it doesn't always reflect it. I do believe, but I don't believe as well as I could. I do believe, but I don't believe as well as I should, or Lord willing, as well as I will one day. And so I can't speak for you this evening. But tonight I join with the father of the demon-possessed boy, and I say, Lord, I do believe. Help my unbelief. Thank you for your time.